I never went into my brother's room after that winter. I was 6, or almost 7 to be more precise. Corey was 15, sullen and cocky by turns. Because of the difference in our ages, he seemed almost like a representative of an exotic species living in my own home, a person who had unbelievably known my parents, for a full 8 years longer than I had. We lived in an older part of town, and there were kids of all ages on our street. I usually played with the Miller girls from around the corner, or sometimes with Simon, the bookish little boy next door. Corey, of course, hung out with a group of guys his own age, riding bicycles, playing video games, lighting stolen firecrackers, and harassing the neighborhood girls. No matter what their ages or predilections, though, all the local kids knew about old Heartworms. There was a cemetery with the idyllic name of Fisher's Hills, just 2 blocks from our house. It was a pretty standard cemetery, small but well kept, with a neat green lawn punctuated by clean, evenly spaced stones. Most of the stones had fresh flowers put on them once a week. But behind the main part of Fisher's Hills, chaos and disrepair reigned. Here, graves were broken or kicked over. Grass and weeds were allowed to proliferate and grow into the cracks in the stones. No fresh flowers were ever in evidence, just some mummified petals from bouquets placed by mourners who were probably now long dead themselves. Corey told me once, in one of his rare truthful moods, that the back of the cemetery was a dumping ground for people who couldn't afford a decent burial or who were unidentified. I had lain awake all that night after he told me, thinking how horrible it must be to die without anyone knowing who you were. The story of old Heartworms was another one I originally heard from Corey, though I heard other versions from some of the kids my own age. Apparently he was a homeless man who had dropped dead in the gutter of the town's main street one day a long time ago, maybe even when my parents were still children. There had been a citywide search for his next of kin, but no one had come forward to claim him. A few days later, he was duly interred in the back of Fisher's Hills, with no headstone. But then, according to the legend, the worms that had started their dirty work on the old man got into his heart and inadvertently got it going again. Heartworms woke up in a foul mood and dug his way out of his pauper's grave, bent on revenge on a city that had treated him with such disrespect. It was said that people who passed Heartworm's grave late at night, or said his name 3 times aloud, would soon hear his rotting footsteps behind them and the stench of his decaying breath on their necks. A few seconds later, he would rear up and tear out your heart right through your chest and eat it while you died. Depending on who was telling the story, it could be more or less graphic. When Corey told it, he'd turned off the lights in my bedroom and held a flashlight under his chin, going into great detail about the worms eating at old Heartworms' face, chewing up the flesh, squirming in the poor man's eye sockets. I had screamed and begged him to stop, but I hadn't wanted him to, not really. The fear was too delicious. Corey had told me about Heartworms when I was only 4 years old, and I didn't hear too much more about the old man until early that winter. It happened that shortly after Thanksgiving that year, the year I was almost 7, there was a succession of 3 murders, unheard of in a small, close-knit town like ours. There was no apparent motive for the crimes, and the victims were not connected in any way. One was a drifter, one was a young schoolteacher, and one was a priest. All 3 were terribly mangled, cut to ribbons with unbelievable fury. The stories about Heartworms began circulating again after the 3rd body was found right near the cemetery, all bloody flayed limbs scattered among the weeds. But the police dismissed the rumors as silly, explaining that we had a serial killer in our midst. They even claimed they had a couple of suspects, which they were investigating with all the resources at their disposal. It also happened that one of Corey's classes at school was planning a local history pageant to be given the day before school let out for Christmas break. Each student had to pick a local historical figure and give a spoken report, dressed as the person he was reporting on. And of course, the subject of every report had to be submitted ahead of time to the teacher for approval. Corey told his teacher that he was doing the report on Uriah Hastings, a famous Civil War general from the area. But really, he was planning to do a report on Heartworms. I'm not sure if anyone else knew of his plans but me, and the only reason I knew was because I went into his room one day to look for one of my missing toys, and saw the costume he was making. Normally, he kept it under his bed so that our mother wouldn't see it, but he had just run to the kitchen for a Coke and so had left it in the middle of the floor. It was hideous. I could see that already. Corey wasn't the artistic type, but he had always been good with his hands. To this day, I don't know exactly what he made the costume out of, but it was eerily effective. The body was really nothing more than rags and corn syrup blood, with ribs artfully drawn in here and there with paint and markers. He'd even glued a few rubber worms on there and rubbed the whole thing with dirt from the backyard. The face, though, is what still haunts me all these years later. It looked alive, even with its empty staring eye sockets and flat deflated shape. Corey had taken handfuls of the rubber worms and glued them into the semblance of a nose and mouth, then painted the whole thing black, with accents of blood red, punctuated by sprinkles of red glitter. I remember finding a piece of red glitter on the bottom of my bare foot many years after that winter, and I screamed and screamed until my mother came running, at which point I fell into her arms in a dead faint. I still can't stand the sight of red glitter. Nowadays, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I always think of the empty hallways of our old house and think of glitter winking at me from the cracks in the floorboards. Corey came from downstairs and saw me looking into his room, and he yelled at me and punched my arm hard. Then he pushed me out into the hall and slammed the door in my face. But at that point, I didn't care. I didn't want to see old Heartworms lying there on the floor anymore. I didn't even like the thought of it in there, its wormy countenance just waiting for Corey to climb inside and animate it. The thought of Corey's eyes behind that face, blinking out at the world, made my stomach clench, and I ran for my own room, throwing myself under the covers. All through the next month, the Heartworms costume was never far from my mind. Ordinarily, I would have been excited about the impending holiday and kept myself busy daydreaming about the 2 weeks of vacation from school and the present Santa would inevitably bring. But that year I was subdued, fearful. My mother kept asking if I was sick, and I would deny it, but her constantly knitted eyebrows let me know that I wasn't convincing her. There was also another murder in the interval between Thanksgiving and Christmas. This time the victim was a bank clerk. A man, covered with blood and carrying a black bag full of knives and scalpels, was apprehended leaving the victim's house. This man was later determined to be the serial killer the police had sought. He had no reason for his crimes, but was simply a psychotic madman picking off people at random, which happens more often than most of us probably like to think. Once he was in custody, the whole town seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. A few days later, though, he escaped from the police station. They never did find him again. On the day before Christmas vacation, Corey stuffed his Heartworms costume into a gym bag and climbed onto his bicycle. I watched him as he rode off, wondering if he was going to get into trouble for giving his report. I imagined his teacher wouldn't have much of a sense of humor about the whole thing, especially considering the whole serial killer business. Did I have a premonition that day as Corey cycled off toward school? I've asked myself that question many times in the ensuing years, and I still don't have a satisfactory answer. Even if I had known, what could I have done? I was only a 7-year-old girl then, who knew nothing of the world. So I watched him go, and then I turned and walked in the opposite direction, toward my own school. Corey never came home that day. I still remember the street growing darker outside, and the sound of my mother's frantic voice as she called everyone she knew in the neighborhood that had a boy Corey's age. "Have you seen my son?" she asked all of them, and none of them had. His teacher said he'd been in school that day. He had given his report, and even though his history teacher was angry, she hadn't scolded him too harshly. The other kids had thought his costume was hilarious, and as history was his last class of the day, Corey had left the costume on as he left school, pushing his bike toward home. That was the last time anyone had seen him, dressed as a legendary homeless killer, pushing a huffy 10-speed down the sidewalk. Mother didn't sleep that night. I don't think anyone in the neighborhood did. There were flashlights and dogs, men shouting in the streets well into the small hours. I wrapped a blanket around myself and curled up on the couch, watching TV but not seeing it, instead seeing Corey's eyes blinking behind a mask of worms and red glitter. I knew when they had found the body because my father carried me up to my bedroom and tucked me under the covers. He left the lights on but closed the door firmly behind him. His face had been very pale. I strained to hear what he and Mother were saying downstairs, but all I could hear was more shouting from outside, and then crying and wailing, and a dog howling somewhere not far away. They didn't tell me exactly what had happened, of course, but I found out much later. Corey's body was found in Fisher's Hills, near the back where all the weeds grew wild. He was still in his Heartworms costume. I was told that the head of the costume had been torn from the body, and that Corey's head was still staring out from behind the mask. His chest was nothing but a mass of blood and exposed ribs beneath the rags. Red glitter was ground into the dirt around the body, as though by a heavy boot. I'm 20 years older now, and I live far away from that old house where I grew up. I lived there for another 11 years after that winter, and like I said, I never went into Corey's room in all that time. His killer was never caught, and even though the police made a great show of trying to solve the case and pin the murder on the escaped serial killer, deep down I think everyone in town knew what had happened. In a way, I can't blame old Heartworms for what happened to my brother. I suppose it's never wise to mock the dead, especially those whose existence has been so plagued with sorrow. And even now that I'm miles away, I still don't say his name out loud. I picked up the girl on a different street than usual. I figured that since she was going to be my last one, I'd alter the routine some, have a sort of celebration. I didn't really look at her as she got in the car, just a quick glance, enough to see that her face seemed crooked, as though her jaw had been broken at some point and hadn't healed properly. She was also a little on the hefty side, but that was okay. I told her that I lived way out in the woods, but that I'd pay her extra if she'd come out there with me. I put on my most disarming grin. She just said that's fine, not concerned at all. She had sized me up when she first got in beside me. I had noticed her doing it. Evidently, she didn't think I posed any threat. That was good. After speaking, she stared straight ahead out the windshield, her painted lips hanging slightly open. I handed her some folded bills, and then I pulled away from the curb. She didn't say much on the long drive, just gave me one-word answers to my innocuous questions. I didn't ask her name, and I didn't tell her mine. When I had driven off the main highway and the trees closed in around the narrow 2 lanes, I asked her if she minded doing, kinky stuff. I glanced at her again, and in the green glow of the instrument panel, I thought I saw the ghost of a smile. "I'll do what you pay for," she said. I decided I liked this girl very much. The tires crunched on the dirt road as I stopped the car in front of the house. I had left the porch light burning, but its yellow glow seemed insignificant, a paltry flame in the midst of a vast black wilderness. I could hear the deafening chirp of the crickets even before the car door was open. "It's pretty dark out here," said the girl. I was alert for any quaver in her voice, any sign of nervousness, but there was none. She was just making conversation. "I'll put all the lights on when we get inside." I patted her knee, brotherly. Then I got out of the car. I heard her following me, her high heels thumping up the porch steps. I flipped on all the lights as soon as I crossed the threshold, just like I said I would. The house looked warm and cozy, curtains closed against the night, wooden floors shining softly. "Nice place," said the girl. "Thanks." I shrugged off my denim jacket and draped it over the back of the sofa. "Can I get you some water or juice or something? Sorry I don't have anything stronger, I'm not much of a drinker." "Thanks, I'm fine." "Then have a seat." I watched her as she settled into the easy chair next to the fireplace. She was looking around, taking in the rustic hominess. She seemed completely at ease. "I'll be right with you," I said. She nodded absently, staring down at the Navajo rug under her feet. I pushed through the door to the kitchen, my skin already feeling hot. I opened the drawer next to the refrigerator and took out all the supplies. The small blade, a roll of gauze, a few squares of paper towel, a clean mason jar. When I went back into the living room carrying them, I saw her gaze slide from my hands to my face to my hands again. Her eyes widened just a touch, and one eyebrow rose, questioning, but otherwise she was as relaxed as before. She's a tough one, I thought, and started to sweat through my clothes. Some of the girls started to protest at this point. Some of the more skittish ones would have been already bolting for the door. I held up my hands, showing her the things, familiarizing her with them. "I won't hurt you," I said. "Is it okay?" She looked almost amused. "What are you going to do?" I knew my cheeks were burning red, and I knew she thought I was blushing. I'm sort of into bloodletting. I knelt down on the floor in front of her chair. She nodded slowly. I've met a couple like you. You won't take much, will you? No, not much. I don't need much. I was getting excited. My voice was starting to shake, and I made myself calm down. I've even got some bandage, see, for afterwards. I held up the roll of gauze. She'd been wearing a long-sleeved top, sheer but not transparent, just teasing. She pulled it over her head and tossed it onto the floor. She didn't have a bra on underneath. Are you going to fuck me then? She asked. No, I just need your blood. Then I can do it myself. Okay. The girl was probably no more than 19, but she acted older, wiser, like she was humoring me in a childish whim. I saw the attitude a lot in the girls I brought home, but mostly I could tell it was all a put-on. With this girl, I couldn't tell. Where are you going to take it from? She asked. I'll make a small cut on your arm. I won't hit any major veins or anything, don't worry. I do this a lot. I guess so. She laid her arm out flat, underside up, just like she was giving blood at the doctor's office. Do I get a tennis ball to squeeze? Her eyes were sparkling. I laughed. It sounded a bit high, giggly, but otherwise normal. You can squeeze the gauze roll if you really want to. She took it from me and curled her fingers around it. Her nails were painted pink, but chipped on the edges. Well, let's go, Drac. She really was something else. Most of the other girls were scared or blasé or sullen or a combination of the three. Okay, I said. I had the little knife in one hand, nice and sterile, and in the other I held the mason jar that I positioned under her arm to catch the spill. Are you going to let me watch you drink it? She asked. I had the feeling she was starting to enjoy herself. It's not for me to drink. I need it for something else. I'll have to wait and see then, huh? Yep. I smiled at her, making it all a joke, a conspiracy between the two of us. Me, the eccentric, middle-aged guy with his cabin out in the woods, she, the screwed-by-life hooker with the dry wit and the girlish pink fingernails, and the crooked jaw. I drew the blade across her flesh, quick and decisive. It hurt less that way, or so some of the girls had told me. Still, this girl sucked in her breath through clenched teeth, obviously in pain, but she didn't cry out. A line of red welled up immediately and began to drip. She watched, fascinated, as I held the jar there, collecting her vital fluids. I never took much, it wasn't necessary. When there was about 1/4 of a crimson inch in the bottom of the jar, I scraped the lip of it across her arm, sopping up the leftovers, then blotted at the wound with some of the paper towels. Here, press that down, I told her, and then I unrolled a length of gauze and wrapped it tight around her arm, bloody paper towels and all. It's not very deep, I said. The bleeding will stop soon. She bent her arm up at the elbow, holding the gauze in place and watching me as I set the jar down on the floor between my knees. There was some blood clumped around the lip, and a few gaudy streaks running down the inside of the glass, but that didn't matter. I unbuckled my belt and then undid my jeans. Do I have to do anything else? She asked. She wasn't smiling anymore, but she didn't look upset, just curious. No, just relax. Keep holding your arm. My erection was raging by this time, pushing at my underwear like a beast in a cage. I freed it, and even though it was warm in the cabin, I felt a cold breath on the tender skin. I hardly needed to touch myself at all. It all came flowing out of me, and I fumbled with the jar, managing to get all of it in there, white over red, strawberries and cream, elixir meets elixir. The girl's eyes were like probing lasers on the top of my head. I knew she was staring, even though I wasn't looking at her. I was panting, my hand still full of my wilting organ. I shook it briefly over the jar, making sure the last few pearly drops found their mark among the girl's proteins. Then I wiped myself clean with the last paper towel and zipped back up. It had taken less than 30 seconds. As I screwed the lid on the jar and held it up to the light, mesmerized by the mingling fluids, I caught the expression on her face. She didn't look scared, but the corners of her mouth were turned down in mild distaste. I expected her to say something, come up with some witty comment, but she didn't. I was disappointed. I thought we were establishing something of a rapport. I peered closer into the jar. I knew she couldn't see them, but I could. Millions of them, moving, feeding on the warm woman blood beneath. I could see a tiny body inside each cell, perfectly formed and whole, waiting to feed and grow, getting a little stronger and a little bigger every day. The girl did speak then. Hey, mister, if you're done, I wouldn't mind getting back out to my spot before it gets much later. I knew she was disgusted by me now and trying not to show it. She had that much class at least. In a minute, I said, I'm just checking to see if your blood is sufficient. Sufficient for what? She was interested despite herself. For them to feed on. Who? The homunculi. The homo what? She had reached down and retrieved her shirt and was carefully putting it back on over the gauze. The miniature men inside the cells. She leaned forward, trying to see into the mixture in the jar. You're kidding. You mean inside the sperm cells? Yes. She threw back her head then and laughed, really laughed, the sound rumbling up from someplace deep in her belly and painting the walls with mirth. You really think that there's a little man inside each of your sperm cells? There is. Okay. She rolled her eyes. Then she got to her feet, pulling the wrinkles out of her blouse with her unbandaged arm. You seriously need some counseling, or some sex education, no offense. From where I sat, she looked like a giantess. None taken. Good. She walked over to the door as if she lived here and was just going out for a pack of smokes. Are you going to take me back now? I stared into my jar, mentally saying hello to each and every one of my new creations. They seemed to be enjoying the blood, feasting on it with great gusto. I tried to estimate how many there were in there, a few million surely, but it was hard to count them when they kept moving around, and to be honest, they all looked pretty much alike, but there had to be enough now. I glanced up at her. Why don't you wait out in the car? It's unlocked. I'll just put this away and then I'll be right out. Sure thing. She shook her head at me, again like a mother grappling with the strange fantasies of a child. You know, I've met a lot of weirdos in my time, but I must say that you take the cake. Was there something like admiration in her voice? Thanks. I didn't know quite how else to respond. Go on, I'll catch up. Take your time. In less than a second, she had gone out into the night, shutting the door quietly behind her. I heard her heels again, clicking on the boards of the porch. Then I heard another noise. She was a tough one, all right. She screamed like the Dickens, and it took a long time for those screams to weaken and finally whimper out to silence. I almost felt bad about it. She seemed like a nice enough girl, kinda spunky, which I like. But what else could I do? The fully grown ones have to be fed just like the baby ones do, and they develop a taste for women's blood while they're still in the jar. It's pretty much all they'll eat. I'm not sure how many there are, of the big ones I mean. They live out in the woods all around. I don't have enough room for them in my house, of course. At night, if you look very hard into the trees, you can see them. The girl must have seen them as soon as she walked down the porch steps toward the car. They get antsy when they know there's fresh meat in the place. She must have seen a whole wall of them out there, coming toward her, a bit stunted and misshapen, but otherwise bearing a more than passing resemblance to me. I wonder how she felt about that. I took the jar into the kitchen and placed it on the windowsill. They always like to be able to see the sunrise. I'm not sure how many are in the jar, and I'm not sure how many are in the woods, like I said, but I know there are at least a few million of them, probably closer to several million, a bigger number than any army on Earth. I wasn't certain before, but I know now that I have enough. Are you sure you're ready for this? The doorbell rang. Too late now, isn't it? Deborah laughed ruefully. Don't worry, I'm fine. Kevin answered the door. Anna stood there, dark hair pulled into a bun, bottle of wine in hand. Sorry, I just remembered she probably can't drink this. Deborah, standing behind her husband, smiled and took the bottle. A small glass won't hurt me, or the little resident. She put her hand on her midsection. Charlotte arrived next, then Jeremy. Once everyone was inside, Kevin disappeared into the kitchen. Deborah followed him, but he shooed her out. Go on, sit with the guests. Everything's under control." 15 minutes later, the food was on the table, and wine had been poured into everyone's glass except for Deborah's. She wanted to save hers for afterwards. "Thanks for coming, everyone. It means a lot to me." She looked around the table at each of them in turn, with her warmest glance reserved for her husband. Kevin squeezed her hand. "Least we could do, honestly," said Jeremy. "I can't even imagine the shitstorm you must be going through." "Well, we can sort of imagine it," Hanna amended, "but it must be 100 times worse for you." As if on cue, there was a sharp banging on the windows, and then the sound of raucous, fading laughter and epithets. Everyone around the table was silent for a few moments. Then there was an outburst of uncomfortable chuckling. "Exhibit A, ladies and gentlemen," said Deborah. "You two get this all the time?" Charlotte was by far the youngest of the group, as her guileless anxiety and acne-scarred face attested. She turned to Kevin. "Door's locked, right?" "Yes, it is. And yes, it's been pretty constant, but it's nothing we haven't weathered before." Jeremy tore off a chunk from his dinner roll and buttered it thoughtfully. "This case was so much bigger than any of Deborah's others, though. Maybe you should think about going away for a while, or changing your phone numbers at least." "It'll blow over soon enough. It always does." Deborah patted Jeremy's hand. "Thanks for your concern, though." Jeremy smirked. "No problem." Later, once Kevin had cleared the dinner dishes and brought out the coffee, Charlotte said, "So how does this work? Now that the trial is over, are you allowed to talk about it?" She'd probably rather not. Kevin gave his wife a sidelong glance. The point of the party was to try and forget about all that for a while. Deborah waved a hand at him. "I don't mind, but there isn't much to tell." "She wants to know if you think Cooper did it." Jeremy was on his third glass of wine, and his pale blue eyes were shining. "It wasn't my place to determine that." "You are painfully ethical, Deborah," said Hanna. "But I'm technically not a lawyer, so I can tell you that I absolutely think he did it." Deborah raised her eyebrows in mock surprise. "You're in the majority, then." "I think you thought so, too. Just a feeling I got." Deborah sat back in her chair and pondered this. Kevin asked her if she wanted wine, and she said she did, so he got up to get it. Charlotte got up also. "Excuse me, folks, I have to use the ladies. Don't talk about anything interesting until I get back." "Same goes for me, except I need the gents," Jeremy said. He got unsteadily to his feet. "Top of the stairs," Kevin said as he went into the kitchen. When everyone was back at the table, Deborah said, "Honestly, I was kind of ambivalent about Cooper. I'm not sure he's capable of the brutality he was accused of, but I didn't like him personally. He gave me the creeps. I felt like he kept trying to push our relationship in inappropriate directions." She frowned into her wine glass and then laughed. "Was that diplomatic enough for you?" "You can't blame the guy, Deborah. You are by far the hottest and blondest of all the defense attorneys in town," Jeremy said. "I'm still sorry I fucked all that up." Deborah's voice was gentle and a little teasing. "Let's not go there, Jeremy. No more wine for you." Jeremy ducked his head and mumbled an apology. The clock struck 10, then 11, and still the guests made no motions to leave. Jeremy had sobered up, but kept mostly quiet as the others discussed topics other than the Cooper murder trial. Deborah's pregnancy, Kevin's impossible class load, Charlotte's master thesis, Anna's dying mother. Deborah listened and conversed pleasantly, but as the night wore on, the exhaustion began to take a toll on her. The party had been her idea, but perhaps the stress of the trial and the ensuing media skewering had affected her more than she thought. She gave an inward sigh of relief when Kevin finally said, "Let's wrap this up, everybody. Deborah's about to pass out." "God, we're so uncouth," Hanna said, "sitting here yapping until all hours." She grabbed her purse from under her chair and stood up, rounding the table to set a hand on Deborah's shoulder. "Get some rest, honey. You've really been through the ringer." Jeremy spoke at last. "Anna's right. Matter of fact, you should blow off next week. Let Anna and I handle things, just until the frenzy dies down." Deborah raised her hand to protest, but Kevin headed her off. "I'll make her take a break, I promise," he said, even as Deborah was shaking her head. "Good night, everybody, and don't you dare offer to stay and help clean up. I'll do that tomorrow." "We weren't going to offer anyway," Charlotte said with a wink. The guests dispatched into the night. Deborah tumbled into bed at just past 1 without even brushing her teeth. She had no idea when Kevin came to bed. When she awoke 6 hours later, the sheets were covered in blood. "I'm not leaving you alone." Kevin stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, face bathed in morning light. Deborah propped herself up on her pillows, wincing at the pain in her abdomen. I'm not an invalid, Kev. You took care of me all weekend. You've got your classes. It's finals week. I'll be fine. He sighed. Deborah, for Christ's sake, this isn't a biggest badass competition. You've been crucified by the public since that damn trial ended, and now this. His voice faltered, but he recovered quickly. You're staying in that bed getting some goddamn rest like you should have been doing before, and I'm staying right here with you. Deborah recognized the finality in his tone. Normally she would have countered this with a more commanding finality of her own and gotten her way, but she was too drained to argue with him. She had to remind herself that he too was suffering a loss. With a nod, she relented. The next day, though, she put her foot down. It wasn't that she didn't want him around, but she disliked the feeling of being someone's burden. Kevin grudgingly gave in to her on the condition that she take the entire week off from the firm, as Jeremy had suggested. She wasn't happy about it, but maybe everyone was right, and she was only hurting herself and others by trying to be superhuman. Once Kevin had gone to work and the house was quiet, she found herself thinking of the potential child that had suddenly vanished on Saturday morning, in a torrent of blood and agony. The pregnancy had been accidental, and at first she'd been as ambivalent about it as she'd been about Kenneth Cooper's guilt. But in the 3 months since she'd found out, the idea of motherhood had become more appealing, not least because Kevin had started to change too, rediscovering a tenderness that she hadn't even realized she'd been missing from him until it returned. It wasn't as though they'd been having problems before, but there had been a distancing, perhaps inevitable given their demanding careers and long marriage. The baby, she thought, could have been just what they needed to draw them back together. And now it was gone. She pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes. It wasn't the end of the world, she thought. They could always try again. She surprised herself by smiling and then drifted off to sleep. An insistent pounding on the front door awakened her hours later. Scowling, she turned onto her side, but then noticed that her cell was flashing from the nightstand. She grabbed it, expecting another prank call, but instead there was a text from Jeremy. Just me, open the door. Deborah shrugged into a robe and picked her way downstairs. When she opened the door, Jeremy was standing there in his trim gray suit, a green-wrapped pot of bright yellow ball-shaped flowers nearly concealing his face. Deborah couldn't help grinning as she leaned against the door jamb. You shouldn't have. Jeremy peeked around the blossoms. I would take credit for these if they didn't look like something Dr. Seuss dreamed up. They were delivered to the office this morning. Who were they from? Deborah stood aside so Jeremy could bring the flowers into the house. I'll let you uncover that fun fact. He set the pot down on the dining room table. She pulled the card free from its envelope and read the crabbed scrawl aloud. Thank you for everything you did for me, and so sorry for your loss. Best, Kenneth Cooper. She looked up into Jeremy's face. My loss? Does he know about the miscarriage? How could he know? It's the internet age, Miss Thorne. Everyone knows everything about everybody. She brushed her hand across the flowers, sending a fine rain of yellow powder down onto the tabletop and the slight scent of cinnamon and vinegar into her nostrils. Jeremy tilted his head. I'm glad you took some time off. You don't look so great. Thanks, smooth talker. You know what I mean. You needed the rest. He paused, staring down at his shoes. And I'm sorry, about the baby and about being kind of an asshole at your party. You weren't an asshole, and it's fine. Don't get sentimental, it gives me hives. He smiled, still not looking at her. Same old Deborah. Finally, he met her eyes. I gotta split. Go back to bed. I don't want to see you at the office until at least next week, deal? You men, always conspiring to keep a lady down. I promise to be scarce. Good. Get better, sweetheart. He gave her an awkward hug and showed himself out. After the sound of his car engine had faded into the distance, Deborah poured some coffee and stared at the cheerful riot of blossoms. She hadn't heard from Kenneth Cooper since the trial had ended, but he was still thinking of her, it seemed. She pulled her robe tight and tapped her foot against the floor, not sure if this was a worrying development or not. Had the card simply thanked her, she would have written it off as genuine appreciation, laced with a little flirtation. But the fact that he'd mentioned her loss was troubling. She was still deep in thought when Kevin came through the front door, startling her. She looked at the clock and realized it was nearly 8. Kevin answered her unasked question. I had some catching up to do. Sorry I'm late. I stopped and got Chinese. I figured you'd be hungry. She was. They ate at the table in silence as the yellow flowers bobbed softly between them. After a few minutes, Kevin pointed. "Should I ask?" "They're from Cooper." He plucked the card from the pot and read it. His brow furrowed. "He knows our address?" "They were at the office. Jeremy brought them by." He looked at her. "Is this something we should be concerned about?" "I don't know yet." Kevin nodded. "Do you need me to stay with you while you're home?" He paused a beat. "Never mind, I already know." He laughed a little sadly. "Just thought I'd offer." She reached for his hand and twisted his fingers in hers. "I appreciate it, but let's not freak out just yet." "Okay, just let me know." He slipped his hand from hers and went into the living room. Deborah heard the TV come on. The next day, Deborah was beginning to feel almost back to normal, which meant she also felt unbearably useless. She woke early, shortly after Kevin left, and paced around the kitchen and dining room for an hour, the flowers always skirting the edges of her vision, reminding her of her enforced quarantine. At last, she grabbed the blooms and took them into the garage, where she chucked them unceremoniously into the trash. Then she called Anna, hoping there would be some catastrophe at the firm she'd need to sort out, but Anna was unequivocal. "We don't need you, Thorne. Stay the hell home." Finally, Deborah gave up and collapsed onto the couch, flipping the TV on. Even now, all the news networks were still harping about Cooper's exoneration, repeating the lurid details of the crime again and again. Pretty 22-year-old victim found in her car with her head blown off, her body a horror show of bruises and stab wounds. Cooper admitting he'd dated the girl briefly, admitting he'd been enraged when she dumped him. Deborah stared at the screen flatly as her own picture appeared beside those of Cooper and the victim. "Here's the apex of the sick triangle," the news seemed to whisper, "the woman responsible for the monster going free." Deborah turned it off and went back to bed. It was dark when she awoke, and the house was completely silent. Blearily, she reached for her phone. 9:30. She scanned her messages. All were cranks. She dialed Kevin, but got his voicemail. "Where are you? It's late." She hung up, feeling disembodied. An hour later, Kevin had still not replied. Deborah threw on some clothes and grabbed her keys. As she opened the front door, something white caught her eye. She turned. Pinned there on the door was a baby booty, splashed with red. She slammed the door and locked it. She called Kevin again first, but he still wasn't answering. Next, she dialed Jeremy. "Can you come over here? I think something bad is happening." She told the same to Anna, and both told her they were on their way over. Then she called Doug, an old friend in the police department, explaining tersely about the booty, the flowers, Kevin's uncharacteristic absence. Doug was audibly alarmed and promised to send an officer right away. After that, there was nothing to do but wait. Anna arrived first, followed closely by the officer and Jeremy. As calmly as she could, Deborah repeated the events in a voice that sounded robotic to her ears. Spoken aloud, the string of incidents struck her as laughably insignificant. The flowers could have been a simple well-wishing gesture. The booty could have been one of the innumerable crazies who had harassed her in the wake of the trial. Kevin's lateness could have a million explanations. Deborah regarded her three-person audience balefully. "Sorry to make such a big deal. It sounds paranoid." Jeremy began to protest, but was silenced by the simultaneous sounds of Deborah's phone chirping and the officer's radio erupting in a burst of static. Deborah snatched up the phone. "Got a call," said Doug. "Body found in a car in a parking lot off 47th. Registered to Kevin Thorne. ID on the body is his, too. I'm so sorry." She ended the call without answering. The officer was talking into his radio, occasionally glancing at Deborah with an expression of grim consternation mixed with pity. Deborah's legs threatened to crumble beneath her, but she managed to stay upright. Her vision swam. "Mrs. Thorne," the officer said, "the victim was found shot and stabbed in a manner consistent with the Cooper murder. There's an APB out for Cooper now. Victim's wallet was untouched, but his keys are missing. Do you have somewhere else you can stay?" Jeremy put his hand on her elbow. "She can stay with me for a few days." Deborah was shaking her head before she'd even fully processed his words. "That's not a good idea, Jeremy. Cooper knows you and Anna. If he found me, he can find either one of you. I can't put you two at risk." "A hotel, then. I can stay with you," Anna said. Deborah's phone chirped again, startling her so much she nearly dropped it. She looked down at the screen. Charlotte. She answered, and immediately the young girl's voice was a keening litany in her ear. "Deborah, have you seen Kevin? I've been trying to call him for hours, and he's not answering, and his secretary said she hadn't heard from him since he left today, and I—" Deborah interrupted gently. She told Charlotte everything that had happened as coherently as she could, steeling herself against the hysteria that threatened to engulf her. There was a long silence on the other end when she had finished, so long that Deborah thought she'd been disconnected. Then she heard a faint sniffle. "But I just saw him, Deborah, in class today. I'm sorry." She wasn't sure why she was apologizing, but there it was. "Do you need to stay with me?" Charlotte's voice was barely there, a forlorn ghost. "Cooper wouldn't think to look for you here." Deborah hadn't gotten to know Charlotte as well as she could have over the 2 years she'd been Kevin's grad student, but the thought of commiserating with someone who knew a side of Kevin that Deborah herself rarely got to see was strangely appealing. "I'd like that." Deborah went upstairs, gathered some clothes, and went back down to the living room. The officer was posted at the front door, the radio on his shoulder crackling and squawking. Jeremy's and Anna's faces were distorted masks. "We'll find Cooper, Mrs. Thorne," said the officer. "Yes, all right." Jeremy offered to drive her to Charlotte's, and she accepted. She hugged Anna and allowed the officer to escort her to Jeremy's car. Neither of them spoke on the short drive, and Deborah was glad. Jeremy waited on the curb until Charlotte had opened the door. She waved to him and then ushered Deborah inside. It was a typical student pigsty, littered with dirty laundry and empty food containers, but Deborah barely registered the mess. Charlotte had clearly been crying. Wordlessly, she motioned Deborah into the postage stamp kitchen, where she poured them both a glass of wine. They drank in companionable silence. "I'm sorry all I've got is the couch," Charlotte said between sniffles, once her glass was drained. "I wanted to stay up and talk, but I think we both need to sleep. Maybe we'll wake up and things will be okay again." Deborah had been keeping tears at bay until now, but Charlotte's bare naivete pushed her over the edge. "Maybe so," she managed to say. Once she had settled into the musty-smelling sofa and Charlotte had disappeared into her bedroom and closed the door, Deborah found herself drifting off immediately, even though she had slept for most of the day. She dreamed of her picture on the news, in a lineup that also comprised Cooper and his first victim. There was also a fourth photo of Kevin, but half his face was obscured by a spray of red. She wasn't sure what time it was when she awoke, with a stiff neck and what felt like a slight hangover. The first thing she became aware of was a cheery dash of yellow on the cluttered coffee table directly in her line of sight. She focused with effort, but for a long time she couldn't make any sense of what she was seeing. It was a yellow, ball-shaped flower. Confused, she tried to struggle into a sitting position, but her limbs felt leaden. She stared at the flower, comprehension slow in coming, and then noticed that beside the flower was a white baby booty, and propped against that was a printed photo, a blurry image that looked as though it had been taken with a cheap cell phone. The flesh tones in the photo soon separated themselves into two naked figures, Kevin and Charlotte. There was a sniffle off to her right, and she whipped her head toward the sound. Charlotte was leaning against the kitchen door, her face red and swollen. The pistol in her hand shook slightly, but it was aimed directly at Deborah's head. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, her voice thick. She pulled the trigger. Call it obsession, if you will. You certainly wouldn't be the first. My wife never understood it, even up until the day she left, and I suppose some of my coworkers twirled their fingers around their ears behind my back more than once. I know how it sounds, you see. But it's been there, this obsession, this vast wall before which I am prostrate, insignificant. Before college, before my myriad failures, before Bettina and her bitter farewell, now 2 weeks old, before any of it, there was Riemann. Are you sure you want to hear all this? All right, tape's running, is it? Okay then. Well, my father was a mathematician and a bit of a philosopher. He taught at the college that I attended, and though I shared his compulsive temperament and his love of numbers, the real meat of math, the zany, beautiful, out-there stuff that was my father's stock in trade, it just never made much sense to me. I tried, God knows, but I guess my brain was just too feeble. When I graduated with a degree in accounting, my father heartily shook my hand and went through the whole pride routine with a jolly my son, but I could see his disappointment plainly, there behind his standard-issue horn-rimmed glasses. Sure, accounting is math, and math is math, right? Not to him. Sorry, I was talking about my obsession, wasn't I? God, I've gone funny since Bettina left. I suppose that's why I'm here, isn't it? Anyway, my obsession began, and can many of us pinpoint that exact moment in our lives when all the whizzing atoms and cast-off pieces of detritus seem to solidify before us in a single thunderclap of inspiration, making our eyes pop like expanding planets, and our breath catch in mid-windpipe at the very realization. It was in the summer before my senior year of high school. I was bored one day, as only a reasonably bright teenager perched on the cusp of adulthood can be, and in my lackadaisical shuffle around my father's study, that I remember vividly smelled of dust and tobacco and mothballs, as all father's studies should, I spotted a book that looked interesting. It had some type of constellation on the front, as I recall. I flipped through pages and pages of esoteric symbols and formulas that I longed to understand, but it was like looking at something in a language that is unfamiliar and yet tauntingly familiar as well, as though the meaning is just there, just one level deeper than you're able to go. And how inadequate I felt, standing in a warm, dusty sunbeam in this, my father's sacred place, holding my father's holy book, with its cryptic words that spoke only to him. The last chapter, however, gave me pause. It was mostly text, and as I read it, I felt those spinning atoms converging into the dawn of my obsession. For the Riemann hypothesis, said the magical book with its arcane pattern of stars on the cover, so alchemical, was a mathematical problem long assumed to be true, but never proven, and the subject of much speculation and calculation. Those two words hooked me, never proven. And there, in that room, in my 17-year-old mind that fairly bubbled with hope and promise and arrogance, was the thought that I could do this, that I could be the one to solve the mystery and crack the code. It did not matter that as I read the rest of the chapter of the attempts and failures of the century's greatest mathematical minds, I understood nothing of the grandiose theories, all those little pi's and sigmas and crazy exponents upon exponents that littered the pages like tiny elfin footprints. It did not matter that I had no more than a rudimentary grasp of algebra and trigonometry. I was going to do it. I would solve this thing. And wouldn't my father be astonished, beaming and basking in the light of my genius? My son has solved the unsolvable. All through college, I read everything within my reach about Riemann, about Carl Gauss, about primes and complex numbers and the zeta function. I told no one of my work, scribbling away on odd bits of paper every few minutes of the day, but Riemann was always on my lips and in my thoughts, and I was ready to bellow to the winds of the triumph I was sure was so close at hand. After all, I had the advice of my father, the great mathematician, to guide me. Graham, he said to me once when I was still quite young, to solve any problem, mathematical or otherwise, you must break it down to its component parts. See it for what it is inside, without all the trappings. Words to live by. But years passed, and the dreams of glory and delicious payback began to fade, as dreams of youth seem to do when the hair around the ears begins to sprout gray. All seemed lost until I met Bettina. How wide-eyed and effervescent she was in those days. Without her chiding encouragement, I might have abandoned Riemann once and for all, settling into a mundane existence with my lovely new wife, the equally lovely children we would inevitably produce, and the respectable job at the accounting office, dry as noon in the Sahara. But Bettina adored me in the beginning, before the fights and the boredom and the long silences, broken only by the sound of her pitiful sniffles. She adored me and encouraged me in what I loved. She even feigned interest in my obsession in the beginning, although she told me much later, during a particularly unpleasant argument, that she'd never had the slightest clue what I was talking about and had never given a shit anyway. To this day, I'm fascinated by the fact that no matter how well you think you know a person, when you live together long enough and begin to peel away their layers, so to speak, break them down to their component parts, as my father would say, you find that they're completely different than you thought. It's most disconcerting, but I suppose that's why so many marriages end the way they do, the way mine did. Anyway, where was I? Yes, so it was Riemann and Bettina and me. Strange bedfellows indeed. I seemed to be making progress then during that first year, and the exhilaration of it was all intertwined with that rush of love with the shine still on, of nights when Bettina and I sat up until the proverbial wee hours, discussing math and magic and the universe, then making love on the dark shimmering floorboards of my own study, decidedly less dusty and mothballish than my father's. That was a good year, and I sometimes weep to remember it. Of course, it all went wrong, as it always does. Entropy, I think that's called, isn't it? Descending towards chaos. Bettina spent less and less time communing with me and Riemann in the study, and more time complaining, with puffed and red-ringed eyes, that I was too often holed up in there with him, mooning among my haphazard calculations. She would come in and stare at me, whining that she wanted me to be the way I used to be, as if I was the one who had changed. She wanted us to go away together. She wanted a baby before she was too old. So many things. And I would sit there with my books, her words just indecipherable buzzings to me. That's all they were, her many laments, because you see, I had hit what seemed a fatal obstacle with Riemann, and it was that which occupied my mind, not the heartsick babblings of a dissatisfied wife. She didn't understand. Looking back on it, I'll admit that perhaps I was brooding, even unpleasant, if only slightly. Bettina told me that I'd actually called out the name Riemann during one of our infrequent sexual encounters. Maybe I did, I can't really say. I was, at the time, awash in self-loathing and failure, and all else in my life seemed like the static of a faraway radio signal. Then came the day, just 2 weeks ago, that Bettina announced that she was leaving. When I think about it now, I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but surprised I was, most drastically. Anyone would be, wouldn't they? More than that, though, I felt betrayed, and angered by the fact that she didn't even have the decency to cry or act hysterically as she uttered the fateful words. Her voice was just flat, her face blank, as though she didn't even care anymore. And that, just the sight of that once beautiful face that I had long ago equated with the very visages of angels, hanging there in my study with fish-dead eyes and drooping lips telling me, "It's over, Graham," as if she were discussing nothing more profound than what she'd had for breakfast that morning. Well, I just wouldn't have it. She wouldn't go. It's all a bit blurry from that point. Sorry about that. I stood up quickly, I remember that, the legs of the chair giving an anguished screech as they kissed on the worn floorboards. She didn't flinch or even blink. Why should she? It was only Graham, the mild-mannered accountant, wasn't it? And then bits of Riemann, reams of illegible scratchings that comprise my obsession, my life's work, were flying, seesawing crazily through the air, catching the shards of summer sunlight from the window with blade-like glints of violence. There was a thud and a red rain. There were small rustlings like mice as the last of the papers flitted to the floor, and in the ensuing stillness, oh God, a revelation. I stood before Riemann's fortress, a dark and forbidding place of late, and for the first time in months I could see what might be a way in, a light from heaven itself beaming down upon the path. The component parts, of course, just as my father had always said. You must grasp the problem in both your hands, and hone and refine and divide, again and again, boil everything down to its barest essence, and only there, underneath all the nonsense, will you find the kernel of truth. I went right to work. What? Oh, I'm sorry, Doctor. I seem to have gone past my scheduled time. I know you're very busy, but once I get started, I do apologize. I did want to tell you about the exciting new turn my research took, but that can wait until next time. And by the way, before you go, I'll answer the question that you've no doubt been pondering all along. Did I ever solve the hypothesis after all that? Regrettably, no. There's been so much going on this past 2 weeks, as you well know. But I'm so close, Doctor, so close. Those atoms are converging, I can feel it. I mean, just think of it, Doc. Everything broken down to its very simplest form, peeled to its innermost layer, to the core of its being. Can you appreciate the beauty of that? Is the number 12, for example, just 12? Is it a 1 and a 2, or 3 times 4, or 6 plus 6? Is a human just a body, or so much more? The arms, the fingers, the feet, the toes, the veins, the bones, the molecules, the atoms. The heart even, with its beautiful auricles and ventricles. Everything divided, once and twice and an infinity of times, dividing without end. I know my experiments with Bettina were interrupted, but I won't be stopped. My quest for knowledge is too strong. I'm so close, Doctor. I will solve it.